Well, thank you everyone for joining this session on technology and its role in racialized surveillance. Automated facial recognition, contact tracing apps, and digital identity initiatives are on the rise, as many of you would know. Taking examples from the UK, the EU, and Australia, and touching also on the US, we'll be exploring the implications of these new technologies for migrants and people of color around the world. And in particular, we'll be exploring the ways in which these technologies risk perpetuating racist outcomes in society. So this event has been put together by WebRoots Democracy and the Portal Collective. WebRoots Democracy is a think tank focused on progressive and inclusive technology policy. And the Portal Collective is an activist collective for a radically different future. And in case you're not aware, this issue we're discussing today is something that WebRoots Democracy is actively looking into as part of their project, Unmasking Facial Recognition. You can check it out on their website and a link will be dropped in the chat. And also, like any Zoom call, feel free to use the chat as we go along. You can ask questions as we go through. You can just, have a bit of banter if you please, but that chat is available for you all. So I'm exceptionally excited to introduce this panel today. My name is Yasmin Abdelmajid, but I'm not the important one here. I have with us an incredible panel of folks from essentially around the English-speaking world to talk to us about this topic. So firstly, I want to introduce Gracie May Bradley. Gracie joined Liberty UK in July 2017 and leads campaigning across the UK government's hostile environment policies on immigration, as well as work across policing, counter-terror, privacy and surveillance. She was also recently announced as the new interim director of the organisation, which is amazing. Congratulations, Gracie. And before joining Liberty, Gracie worked in casework, research and policy across several NGOs to support survivors of torture and working migrants to navigate the UK's immigration system. She holds a Master's in Human Rights from the LSE and a degree in Philosophy and French from Oxford University. Next up, we have Dr. Angela Martinez-Dean. Dr. Angela is a senior lecturer in entrepreneurship at Loughborough University, London. Her expertise, research, interests, and communities of practice revolve around digital entrepreneurship, anti-racist, intersectional cyberfeminism, and critical realist philosophy. She's a scholar activist with a track record of building and engaging with community-based organizations. We're also joined by Sarah Chanda, an experienced advisor, commentator, and political activist, linking the issues of racial justice, anti-discrimination, and digital rights in Europe. Sarah is currently working as a senior policy advisor at European Digital Rights, a network of organizations defending digital rights in Europe. Her main files are artificial intelligence, anti-discrimination, ad tech, and hate speech. Previously, she worked in advocacy at the European Network Against Racism and on youth employment policy for the UK Civil Service. She holds a Master's in Migration, Mobility and Development from SOAS and a law degree from the University of Warwick. And then with us also, we have Dakshayani wow, I actually practiced this and Dakshayani is one of my best friends. So I'm really quite embarrassed in this current moment. Dakshayani Surya Kumaran is a Tamil woman and the Director of Human Rights and Racial Justice at the Australasian Centre for Corporate Responsibility. Her work focuses on holding corporations to account who are profiting from human rights abuses as part of border policy regimes. She's a former hydrologist whose career has focused on racial equity in a range of contexts, including climate change and disaster risk reduction, children and young people, as the founder of YLab. She's the board director of Democracy in Colour, Australia's first racial and economic justice organisation led by people of colour, and a member of the editorial advisory board of Pro Bono Australia. Now, with all those impressive bios introduced to you all, I'm going to start with you, Dakshayani. Can you talk us through an overview of the history of surveillance and specifically the racialized nature of it? Because this is a huge topic. And there are lots of ways into it, but I think if we can situate people a little, that would be fantastic. So take us away.
Oh, just a small one to start with, yes. Just a small question. The history of surveillance. I'll do my best. So yes, so mass surveillance as it's practiced today is very much has its roots in colonisation. So surveillance was a tool essentially for classifying people and for controlling these newly acquired populations. So, you know, all through the 14th and the 19th century, European colonizers collected vast amounts of data on the populations that were colonized. And there's many academics who have written kind of a lot about this, but one particular one that I'll draw your attention to is a Palestinian academic. His name is Elia Zureik, and he talks about how modern biometrics all have their roots actually in all have their roots in colonization, and things like fingerprinting that were pioneered and tested in colonial settings are kind of what was the basis of what we use today. And so to kind of make it a bit more tangible, I'll give you a couple of examples. So the first one, I'm going to kind of take you back to colonial India, where the British conducted a mass census where they would collect data on everything, so caste, religion, profession, age, everything from the British perspective. And that would inform, I guess, their rule. And essentially what we all know is that they solidified caste divides, religious divides, and kind of it really enabled them to divide and rule. It gave them the information they required to rule. And so in the Australian context, surveillance of First Nations populations was really driven by this concept of scientific racism. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but just in case you're not, scientific racism is kind of this concept that racial superiority is kind of a real thing that's based on biologically innate traits. And so driven by this bizarre and very dangerous concept, they conducted surveillance on First Nations populations in Australia, and this is what kind of justified colonial acts of violence and kind of established this racialized hierarchy of citizenship where whiteness was at the top. And this kind of kept going with the advent of the White Australia policy, which actually only stopped in as recent as 1973. So whiteness was really core to how citizenship was conceived. And I guess I won't go into heaps of detail, I'll let others kind of jump in, but what I want to kind of really draw people's attention to is how we can still see the implications of these systems of racial classification today and how they kind of impact on how people are criminalised. And so, you know, for instance, today, Indigenous peoples in Australia are the most incarcerated population literally on the planet. And also Australia is very well known for its very abusive border policing policies, including indefinite offshore detention. And so these are the ways that the colonial kind of legacies of surveillance mean that the powerful, so whether it's states or whether it's corporations, how the powerful kind of use surveillance to determine who in society is disposable.
Thank you, Dr. Shiny. Gracie, I'm going to come to you next. Can you talk us through how this, bring us to the UK context today, and how perhaps, Dr. Shiny talked about the sort of the colonial history of surveillance. So what does that look like in a UK context today? And I'm also curious, was this something that, say, was looked at in the Northern Ireland context? Has this been playing out in lots of different areas?
Yeah, so I'm really happy to speak to that point, and happy more generally to kind of look at the question of surveillance as a racialized issue. I think there can sometimes be a tendency to think, oh, there's a new technology, who knows what it will do in society? And actually we would get a lot further, a lot faster if we thought, well, what do states try to do? Who are states generally missing out or oppressing, and what will new technologies do to their capacity to do that? So if that's our starting position, I think we get further faster. I wanted to talk a little bit about a report that my colleague Hannah Couchman wrote in January 2019, which is called Policing by Machine. And essentially she did a whole load of freedom of information requests to different police forces about predictive policing technologies and how they're being used, or their use is being contemplated by different forces in the UK. And what she found was that at that time, at least 14 police forces were using, developing or testing predictive policing systems. So there are kind of two types of systems, very roughly speaking. There are predictive mapping programs, which try to look at where crime is likely to occur or where people are likely to be arrested for crime. And then there are individual risk-based assessment programs, which attempt or claim to be able to kind of predict who is most likely to commit a crime, who are the risky people in communities. And I think in both of those areas, we see that those assessments are racialized. And this really shouldn't be any surprise, because the tools and technologies that we build only have the data from the society that we live in to function. And what we know from things like the Lamry Review is that at every point in the criminal justice process, outcomes are worse and harsher for racialized people than they are for white people. So if you're consistently telling a piece of technology, oh, well, it's Black people that have been arrested most for crime, then of course the output is going to be Black people or people of color, and where those people live are the crime hotspots. So what you don't get is a record of actually where crime is occurring. What you get is a record of where police are already enforcing and who police already perceive to be suspect. And in that way, what you have is an entrenchment and a magnification of patterns of discrimination in society. But what you also have is a kind of tech veneer on those patterns of discrimination, because it's a machine that's doing it. It's a technology that's doing it. And so there's a real risk of kind of human deference to what the machine is saying. But there's also just a real simple lack of transparency, because what this report found was that, yes, some police forces were maybe trying to develop their own off-the-shelf predictive policing tools, but actually other forces were just buying them from, profit-driven corporations. And that meant that the code was proprietary. So the police didn't even necessarily have access to how the machine was making its decision, but all we knew was that the computer was saying it, and therefore people were deferring to the computer. And I just wanted to talk a little bit specifically about a tool that Durham Police were using, which was a tool called HEART. And this was an individual risk assessment tool. And it was being used to determine whether or not someone should go through a formal court process or, some non-court, less formal rehabilitation process, which is already quite a significant decision. And that took into account past criminal history. And of course, we can see how that was likely to be racialized. And it also included proxies for race, like postcode. But I think one of the really interesting and insidious things about HEART is that it was supplemented by a data set that was collated by Experian called Mosaic. And that, I think, really, it made really clear why class analysis is really important in this too, because Mosaic, essentially linked names to stereotypes. So say things like, someone called Stacey was likely to be in a family with significant needs and be on a range of benefits. That's how crude the stereotypes were. And that's one thing, and it's bad enough when you're trying to decide whether or not someone should have credit. It's another thing when you're making decisions in the context of the criminal justice system that are ultimately, about whether or not someone might lose their liberty or, be able to access future employment without discrimination, etc. So I think that's kind of a really granular way in which we see that kind of colonial and racialized mode of policing come home to the UK. But I think I'd also want to emphasize from Liberty's point of view that, yes, this is absolutely an enormous problem for racialized people. But as soon as you start messing with the kind of basic principles of justice, like, are we equal before the law? Are we judged based on the evidence of kind of past activity or on what the state believes we are like? That's obviously a subversion for everybody. That's a problem for everyone and not just a problem for racialized people. And that should be a kind of important part of our analysis in thinking about the kind of advocacy we want to do going forward.
Thanks so much, Gracie, for bringing that granularity, but also reminding us that this is not a new phenomenon in terms of what the state is asking or what the state is trying to do. Sarah, I want to bring you in on this. Are you seeing the same sorts of patterns play out in the EU?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. And let me know if you hear me well. My internet is struggling today, so please let me know. Yeah, we're seeing very similar patterns in the EU, and I can just say that I really appreciate the context that we have in this conversation. Like, often we see that conversations around technology or AI are really framed in this way as if they're like a completely new phenomenon, like surveillance has just sprung up with the development of new AI systems, new facial recognition systems. Obviously, we have to recognize that these deployments come within a much broader context of colonial surveillance, also general racialized surveillance in Europe. So I think we really need to address that. Often these are not really questions of technology per se, but they're questions of how technology is implemented in like already existing power structures. And I think we shouldn't really forget that. Throughout Europe, we're seeing really a lot of similar deployments of different technologies for surveillance means. I also just wanted to point to the fact that, similar to Dakshayini's point about how we look at colonial registers, a lot of these broader infrastructures which enable predictive analytics or which enable facial recognition to work as effective modes of surveillance and law enforcement, migration control, are these massive registers, collections of biometric data, which we don't just see in colonial eras, but we are seeing today. The organization State Watch, which is a EDRI member, has really drawn a lot of attention to this EU level. So you'll see that the development of the Common Identity Repository, which is essentially a really massive scale database of biometric data of non-EU citizens or non-EU people, and how that is being used for increasing the amount of police stops and basically immigration identity controls in Europe today. I think this is a really good example of, if we put surveillance, the collection of biometric data, into a more historical context, what we see is there are not really very different forms. Essentially what we have is a much more sophisticated way of collecting data of criminalized populations, suspect populations, using that in ways that sort of circumvent a lot of the legal safeguards that Gracie, legal safeguards and legal presumptions that underpin our democracies. These systems basically see certain populations as completely exceptional to those systems that we put forward. The GDPR, but also other human rights safeguards that we have developed in Western Europe, those are supposed to be applied to Europe.
Oh, I think we may have lost Sarah briefly there. We'll come back to her because I think that's a really important point around people being seen, communities being seen as exceptional. But Dr. Angela, I'm going to come to you now because I think, and just to kind of supplement what Gracie was talking about this not necessarily, this definitely not necessarily, but certainly this being a reflection of states who are already quite interested in surveilling particular groups. And can you give us some of that US context? Because there are programs that people may or may not be aware of, things like COINTELPRO, etc., where especially activists and activist groups have been surveilled in a very targeted way.
Yes, absolutely. And I just, again, want to echo everybody's, gratitude for the invitation, and welcome to all of those who have joined us here. I am from the US, as you might be able to tell from my accent. I've lived in the UK for 10 years, and so I think I have kind of an eye on both spaces to see what's going on, and I just see a lot of similarities in the patterns. And there's a long history of racialized surveillance of activism in the US, especially activism by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So I think what that suggests is that we need to be talking about this, as all of the panelists have been, as not a hypothetical situation, but a very live, actual situation that has been going on, as they've pointed out, for hundreds of years, but in a very modern context. In the 1950s and 60s, the US state had a program called COINTELPRO, which was short for Counterintelligence Program, which used Cold War strategies and tactics of spying, infiltration, dividing and conquering to destabilize activist movements such as the Civil Rights Movement, such as the Black Panthers, the American Indian Movement, AIM, and all sorts of other grassroots political movements by people of color. And there were a number of well-publicized assassinations that came off of the back of these infiltrations and this surveillance, including the murder of Fred Hampton, who was shot in his home by Chicago police. I believe it was Chicago, I hope I haven't misspoken there, in 1969. And, you know, it really, when doing the research for this talk, it really spoke to me about the fact that what happened in 1969 is still happening today, because the murder of Fred Hampton, the grotesque murder of Fred Hampton reminds me so heavily of what happened to Breonna Taylor. Although Breonna Taylor was to our knowledge, not an activist, and was targeted incorrectly by the police in, I believe it's Louisville, Kentucky. The tactics were the same. And so I think it's really important to make that chain of connection between, you know, the racialized targeting of activists as well as of people who are not activists and who get caught up in the state violence against people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Maybe we'll pause there and we'll keep going because there's so much to talk about.
Thank you, and thank you for reminding us, I think, as well, that the tactics haven't necessarily changed, even at the very sort of a heartbreaking end of it. So thank you all for providing us with that context. And what's really interesting, as we can all see, is that so much of this is very globalized. It's very similar tactics kind of all around the world. One of the major changes, though, that technology has brought, which Gracie kind of alluded to, is the scale and the volume of what we're seeing. And Ivana Bartoletti, who's a writer in this space, asserted in her new book this concept that I really want to get all your thoughts on, around data collection. And so we know that data collection and data classification around particular groups has always been a way that folks have been controlled. But Ivana actually posits that data collection is in itself an act of violence. And I think this is a really interesting one to tease out, because if we're sort of challenging the idea of surveillance and saying that this is something the state has always used, and then we've got an attitude in the kind of mainstream community in that that data collection is a neutral thing. How do we square that? And is it a case of asking people to collect less data? I mean, what's going on? So, Dakshayani, do you mind if I come to you on this? How do you feel about this concept that data is an act of violence? Surely, one might say, it helps us make better decisions.
I love that framing. Data is active violence. I think it really very succinctly says how I expresses how I feel about data. And I think, I guess in a system, as all the speakers have alluded to, and it's so lovely being on this panel and listening to such exceptional people speak about this, but given that we're in a system of racial capitalism, I guess what we see with technologies, even if their initial purpose is, you know, humanitarian, you know, we see UNHCR being the one of the biggest data collectors of data on people seeking asylum and refugees, for instance. What we see is like a function creep towards actually how this data being repurposed and used in more violent ways. And the potential for that is so substantial that you could argue that actually data collection is violence. And so my work centres a lot on border policing and looking at the corporations that profit from that. And it really interesting work being done by an organisation that's based in the US called Mi Gente. They're a kind of a an organizing, they're a kind of a central place for Latinx and Chicanx organizers, and they do incredible work. They're running a campaign called No Tech for ICE. I heavily recommend looking into their work. It's very, very incredible. But they have really kind of unpacked all of the links between some of these major corporate players. So they've really looked at, you know, what's the role that Palantir and Amazon and more recently Thomson Reuters, what are the roles that all of these companies are playing? And they've kind of really mapped it out for us in a lot of detail. So if you look at their research, kind of, you know, explores how Thomson Reuters, which is like seemingly a really innocuous brand, you know, like they just provide these services that we all kind of know about, and like they've got a media thing. But actually what they do is collect data that they use a technology, the acronym is CLEAR. I can't recall what it stands for, but essentially they collect a whole range of data, public and proprietary data, all about people. So it might be license plate data, it might be kind of your social media tracking, it might be a bunch of stuff. And they collect it all into one place that then makes it really easy for Palantir to analyze it and create profiles and build out really, really detailed profiles of undocumented people, which then ICE agents use to create their lists to then do raids in people's homes and workplaces, and then those people get deported. So if you look at that kind of chain, I guess the supply chain of data, it's super interesting that, you know, Thomson Reuters could argue that, you know, we're just collecting this data, it's that we're not doing anything wrong, you know, but it's I guess how data can then be repurposed for really violent ends is why I think that data collection is an act of violence. And I really like the calls that I think her name is Yashimembe Milner around abolishing big data. I think that really speaks to me. I think that that makes sense.
Gracie, I saw you nodding quite a lot there. So would you like to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I was just nodding because I also have been following Mijenti and their fantastic work, and because a lot of my work, again, at Liberty has been around government use of data for immigration enforcement purposes. And actually, in the UK, it's been relatively rudimentary. It's sort of been the Home Office requesting data from other government departments and then looking for addresses of undocumented migrants. I suppose, I mean, this notion of data collection as an act of violence is not something that I've thought about before. And I suppose what I'm wondering about is the extent to which that kind of isolates data collection and divorces it from a wider set of processes, and the extent to which that is or isn't helpful. Because I suppose, yeah, what we've seen in the UK is, you know, children's school records, you know, addresses collected by teachers, you know, potentially for safeguarding purposes, and without their knowledge or consent, and without parents' knowledge or consent, then being given to the Home Office by a central government, by the Department for Education, and then used for immigration enforcement. And so, I mean, I suppose when it comes to the kind of big data stuff and the sort of hoovering stuff up for reasons that, you know, people haven't consented to and that they don't know about, like, obviously I see how that implicates data collection in processes of violence. I'm wondering, I feel a bit more equivocal about just isolating data collection itself, perhaps, especially divorced from kind of consent. I know we can then get into a conversation about what is meaningful consent, etc. But I suppose I just feel a bit more equivocal about that. But just also on the Palantir point then, you know, Palantir has been contracted to do a load of data analytics for the UK's National Health Service in the context of COVID. And Foxglove, which is a kind of tech justice startup, has done a lot of work to force the government to make those data sharing agreements public. But you know, what many groups in the UK have been trying to do is explain why already we don't know everything, but we do know that this is bad news for marginalised people. Because as soon as a group like Palantir has a foothold in, you know, in critical infrastructure like the NHS, you can see how the insights would be used to build something that is compatible with the government's aspiration to essentially build a massive immigration enforcement database, right? So again, I think the kind of transnational nature of the concerns, because of the transnational nature of how corporations work, is kind of really important to keep in the forefront of our minds. And I suppose the last thing I was thinking about just then is Edouard Glissant kind of talking about opacity and what that means, you know, in an age of big data and yeah, just that notion of opacity and what it is to be unknowable to the state, and how important that can be in so many different ways, and how we struggle to retain that.
Yeah, that opacity and that control over how much we are known, I think, is something that's becoming more and more elusive. Sarah, I might come to you because I think there was a couple of things that were mentioned just then that were connecting to what you were saying at the beginning around your work looking at undocumented migrants and the protections they do or don't have under the laws in Western Europe.
Yeah, and a lot of things that have already been said really resonate with me. I think that when we're looking at data collection as a form of violence, of course it is in our world with all the trends that we've highlighted. So like transnational corporations, data exploitation, the use of state resources to criminalize populations, whether they be migrants or whether they be racialized groups or poor people living in Europe today. Like we're talking about racialized surveillance, but we also can't divorce it from the class angle, the gendered angle, the ableist angle of many of these technologies. I think that when we're talking about data collection as a form of violence, within that context, we can see how the profiling of certain like marginalized populations really fits into that. But it's not, again, it's not necessarily, to pick up on Gracie's point, it's not necessarily just the act of data collection, it's the broader context with which you see it in. I'm thinking of many examples of predictive policing across Europe, but also like, for one example in particular in the Netherlands is a really good example, essentially person-based predictive policing system. So like looking at risk assessment tools which try to predict whether certain people may become criminals in the future, for example. ProKid is the name of the program, and it was rolled out in a testing phase across like many police forces in the Netherlands. Essentially what that was looking at was kids, like very, very young kids under 16, collecting databases about them, about whether or not they might be a victim of crime or a future criminal, and putting them into certain categories on the basis of that. I think it's very interesting looking at data collection with respect to that case, because not only do you see that is data collection and profiling of people on the basis of that by the state, redirecting resources that could be used to necessarily help these people, but more from a punitive perspective, redirecting resources to further surveil them. But also you can see how data collection can also point to how these things are discriminatory, right? Which is another argument that's coming up by many different racial justice groups, particularly ones working on racial justice outside of the UK, where you don't have that sort of same access to data which shows the racially discriminatory nature of some of these systems, technologically based or not. So for example, with that case, we saw that some analysis of the figures, they were not racial data, like self-identified racial data. It was basically based on proxies of the migrant background of these kids. Many of them were young Moroccan kids. The data collection there from the state was, of course, a form of violence, but also from anti-racist groups was a way to show that this is not just about privacy in like a very broad, universal way of looking at this case, but it's also about racial justice, child rights, all of these things. And that like community way of like collecting data was a good example of like contesting that, not just on like the broad human rights grounds, but also from a grassroots anti-racist perspective.
That's really interesting to me. I might actually ask you a little more about that because I think we often try to, well, at least from my perspective, we often try to engage with this from a privacy perspective, and try to connect with the sort of the privacy groups and so on. But perhaps is looking at it just from a privacy alone perspective not enough? Like, is it requires as much a privacy plus anti-racist plus intersectional analysis, would you say?
Yeah, I definitely think so. This is not a topic that's divorced from anything else, which you need all of these perspectives, right? And I think that we can maybe all be inspired. So people have mentioned Mi Gente, but there's also just many other amazing initiatives popping up from the US that don't necessarily see privacy and racial justice as oppositional. I'm thinking of Data for Black Lives and other, maybe it's already been mentioned while I dropped out, but like Data for Black Lives is really a good example of that, which it doesn't necessarily stop LAPD spying is another good example, that doesn't necessarily see these things as oppositional, but actually looks at racial justice, gender equality, and all of these things also from a privacy perspective. And I think this is quite different from a more mainstream anti-surveillance perspective, which just sees, I think, surveillance as a thing that affects us all in the same way. I completely take Gracie's point earlier that we actually really need to see these issues as something affecting the whole of society, and we all need to be equally concerned with it. But also at the same time, we need to recognize that your level of vulnerability, or how you are made vulnerable, really depends on your situation within other different power structures, right? Like the amount of data collected onto you is probably going to be different. How that is used and how the state reacts to that is going to be very different depending on how you are gendered, whether you are queer, how you are racialized, and whether you have documents or not. And I think that this is something that I would really like to see more examples of, like a racial justice perspective on anti-surveillance more. Like, I think it's starting, and this panel is a good example of that, of people that are taking it from that perspective. But I think we need to go bit beyond having in our reports, oh, and this technology disproportionately affects migrants, or this technology is more used against Black or brown populations. It's a bit more going beyond that recognition and organizing against those things. The abolition perspective, I think, is one that is a good one, right? Like, not just abolish big data, but also linking your call to abolish big data to other movements that are saying abolish immigration detention, abolish policing, abolish all of these things, and taking a racial justice perspective to this beyond just a more of a privacy perspective will help us, I think, to recognize the connections between all of these different movements.
And can I, just thinking about what you just said, Sarah, I mean, because I think how you just characterized the way it's currently approached sometimes is quite generous, insofar as in many places we're sort of still at the stage of advocacy that says this tech doesn't work on people of color, right? We're still in the stage of people saying the facial recognition isn't seeing these people. There aren't enough people of color building this oppressive algorithm. Like, we're in some spaces in still like a very basic politics of representation that really needs to be shifted.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, the politics of representation angle causes certain perhaps unintended effects, and I wasn't sure if people had heard about the Google contractors who had been sent to Atlanta to capture the faces of homeless or unhoused Black people in order to kind of improve their algorithms, because they know they've been called out. They know they don't have enough experience internally, so they hired contractors to go and collect this data on from vulnerable populations, and it's not having the right effect. So I think the calls really need to come from the communities who are being most affected. For example, the calls of activists in Detroit to ban facial recognition altogether. I think those are the kinds of abolitionist moves that we're seeing being made, and I think that's the horizon that we need to be looking at.
I love an abolitionist perspective, but I'm gonna come back to Dr. Angela, actually, because taking this thread of a racial justice lens on all of these conversations. I'm curious, because you and Dr. Shiny put together the Portal Collective's briefing note on COVID Safe and the NHS X app. And I think that is an example of taking a racial justice lens to a challenge or a conversation that was very live. But tell us about the kind of reaction that, or the kind of response that you got, and both of you maybe can speak to this, because I think it was quite challenging, when you took an explicitly racial justice lens to this work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with the push to develop COVID apps, what we are working in is a culture of fear, right? Because the population at large is already you know, in this place where they are dealing with something that is so unknown and so uncomfortable that they seem almost prepared to accept whatever directives come from the state to try to handle it. And so the kind of pushback that I think we encountered were a lot of people saying, well, my data is already shared, so I have, you know, no more data to give. It's not like I can, you know, I'm already on Facebook, I'm already on Twitter. So it's not like I'm doing anything new by giving these permissions. And then there was another kind of response where it was like, if I have nothing to hide, I have nothing to worry about. And so these kinds of positions of you know, assumed innocence, I think are really problematic, and also just don't take into account this context that we've been talking about for years, that this existed for decades, for centuries. So it seems to me like, you know, it's such a surface level response to what is really a deeply embedded kind of ideological problem about who is allowed to, you know, to be protected and be safe, and who is expected to you know, just be share their data and be available all the time to unimaginable levels of surveillance that could have effects that we're not even looking at. Dakshani, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump into that. I really liked what you were saying about, I guess, the context of fear. And I think that explains to an extent the willingness to kind of take that techno-solutionist approach to what is quite a complex problem. And maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe that explains some of the bizarre responses and trolling that we got from not just like, just from really unlikely, you know, people like activists who do digital rights work, who are saying, don't you care about public health? Why would you be going against these apps? And just like, I guess, like others have said, like an analysis of surveillance that just completely invisibilizes white supremacy and other structures of oppression. And I guess it points to where we are at the moment and how far we have to go. But yeah, it was very interesting. And I guess we can a bit smugly say, I told you so, because the COVID Safe app anyway, in the Australian context, it has been like a bit of a joke, and everyone can widely acknowledges now that it just doesn't functionally work. So there's no question now. But I guess the key points to note are, and the key point that the brief was trying to get to, apart from unpacking some of these functional issues and other concerns, is like that these kinds of technologies are normalizing mass surveillance, and that has implications beyond the immediate situation that we all need to kind of take into account. And I guess the other thing that I would say in a broader sense, not just in Australia, not just related to these apps, but these kind of joint ventures that proliferated as part of the response to COVID between tech giants and governments, point to a really problematic trend, I think, in tech, where the government is now the customer rather than the regulator. And what implications does that then have for our ability to limit the harms of mass surveillance kind of going forward as well?
So we've got about 10 more minutes before we go to questions. And what I want to maybe get us to think about now, and Angela, I'm going to start with you, is the movements towards, you know, what do we now do about this? Like if we've acknowledged that there's a challenge and there's a new version of the challenge perhaps, rather than a whole new challenge. Dr. Angela, what have you seen communities on the ground in the US do in response to this sort of challenge?
What was that, to me?
Oh, sorry, that was to Angela.
Awesome.
Of the abolitionist theories that have been developed over decades by people like Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Mariame Kaba, who have all taught us how carceral logics work in our everyday lives. And when I say carceral logics, I mean the inability of our discourses to work outside of the norms of policing, punishment as equating to justice. So Ruha Benjamin has amazing work on this as well. And I think that what we are seeing is the distilling of that theory into potential applications like defunding the police strategy, like calling to ban facial recognition. Ruha Benjamin has an edited volume, I think it's called Captivating Technologies, where she looks specifically at things like ankle bracelets, predictive policing, and workplace surveillance, and then starts to reimagine what could we do with this tech that is actually life affirming rather than life destroying, that is kind of anti-carceral and is actually more liberatory. What are the possibilities for technology which really could be used in vastly different ways? I mean, we have so much data on who is hurt most. We could use that data to actually direct support and to direct resources. We don't do that. That's not the way our logics are organized, but I think that what we're seeing are, you know, for the kind of defund the police movements, we're seeing calls to pull police budgets down by half and invest that money in social work, or invest that money in community transformative justice trainings and development of new ways of accountability and dealing with harm that doesn't look like anything that we've seen before in our lifetimes. So we're in this quite exciting but also turbulent moment where people are really trying to envision what comes next after neocolonialism, after settler colonialism has been dismantled. What kind of world can we imagine? And I'd like to point people towards an upcoming conference this week that has plenaries that are open to all. It's called the Allied Media Conference. It's based in Detroit. And the plenaries that are on offer are really about kind of writing new worlds. And it does take the reimagining of what is possible. And in this, I take inspiration from decolonial theorists. I would love that Gracie mentioned Edouard Glissant earlier, Sylvia Wynter, people who teach us about what it really means to be human, which is about our relationship with the earth as well as our relationship with technology, and we tend to forget that in settings where we're so kind of techno-solutionist, as Dakshaini said, and not only that, but in remembering what it means to be human, we then can reimagine what stories we want to live by, what myths we want to drive the direction of travel of our species. And it really is a species level question that we're dealing with here. And that's Alexis Pauline Gumbs that I'm quoting. We are being pushed at this moment. I'm going to quote some more folks who have been inspiring me in this moment. Arundhati Roy tells us we are in a portal. We are in a space between what has been and what can be, and Adrienne Marie Brown and her sister Autumn Brown say that we are actually not looking for a moment beyond COVID, but we are in COVID, and we have to learn how to live within this moment as well. So those are the kinds of visionary Black, Indigenous, folks of color, authors, writers, thinkers that are pushing us to come up with creative ways to generate futures that are life affirming.
That was inspiring. I feel, thank you, Dr. Ender, for sharing. And Gracie, I'm going to come to you on this, and picking up from what Angela has shared, but also asking, like, do you think, we've talked about this techno-solutionist way of thinking. Do you think that the solution to these challenges is technological, or is it political? Like, where are our kind of shifts going to come from, in your view?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always keen to kind of, as obviously everybody is on this call, but I'm keen to keep tech situated within the wider political context. And I think ultimately we need to see work that really disrupts the logics that these new technologies kind of help to embed. I think the whole question is made more urgent by new technologies, because as I've said, there's that issue of the scale and the speeds. I mean, if you look at what the UK government is trying to do with immigration enforcement, you can see that we could get to a point where immigration enforcement would be so much bigger and so much more efficient that it would be much more difficult to kind of win that battle on, you know, whether or not people should have rights that are contingent on their immigration status. You can see how that will become far more difficult to win if new technologies kind of become really deeply embedded in state practice and we don't stop that. But I suppose I'm really keen to kind of see the leads taken by people who have been sort of having that political battle and who have been living these issues for a really long time, rather than for us to start with the technology. You know, I can see that there's lots of different suggestions in the comments, and one of those suggestions is show that the technologies don't work. But I think the real risk then is that the conversation is still about tech and is still about trying to make the tech work. And actually, and this is a lesson I've learned in kind of quite a lot of the advocacy we've done on human rights and policing, is that sometimes you need to be having a conversation that isn't about policing and that isn't about tech, but is completely upstream of that, and is actually about, you know, how do we resource communities so that the harm that these things are meant to be the solution to doesn't occur in the first place. And I think that's really the conversation that's about building a society that cares for everybody, you know, in a different way, that's just completely upstream. And it's also less negative than just saying ban this, ban this, ban this, although those calls are really, really urgent and important in the here and now.
Thanks, Gracie, and thanks for reminding us about that urgency. Sarah, I want to come to you next. I mean, just kind of building on what Gracie has talked about, is when we think about building those maybe not tech-focused solutions. I mean, what does an abolitionist movement look like in this space? Is it an anti-AI movement in the same way that there was an anti-nuclear movement a few decades ago, or like, what do you have a conception of what it might look like?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I agree with what Gracie has said, which is basically about situating all of this within a political movement, and that is not also just a political movement that is focused on AI or data collection, but something much broader, and looks at how these technologies have been embedded within a broader, like, punitive system, immigration control context, which is the abolitionist perspective, right? Which is when these resources could have been much better used in genuine attempts to reduce harm, which there are so many other contexts that we could look at them in. I do think that for people that are working in digital rights, it is also about not just connecting with those other movements, but also understanding that, yeah, we need to have those conversations about ban. We're not looking for system tweaks. We're not looking for, like, better ways that we can, just, like, recognize that there might be some harms with these technologies, but actually they could be reformed and be better. But actually it's saying that, well, there are some things that will inevitably have this disproportionate racial impact. They will inevitably increase harm against marginalized communities and the society as a whole, and therefore we need to completely reconsider whether we need them. I see this as oppositional to the conversation about, like, making the tech work or showing that the tech doesn't work, because when we think about those questions, there is basically this assumption that there is, like, a tech that can work in general, universally. It's going to be universally applicable, whereas that conversation doesn't necessarily address these multiple levels of vulnerability that we've all discussed here today. It's about, like, the tech might work for some. Who does the tech work for, actually? It works for companies that benefit from the mass collection of data for profit, right? It works for governments that have very, like, I would say, like, very ad hoc priorities, which are very focused on, like, deportation, very focused on incarcerating people, basically essentially looking at, like, legitimizing the status quo and making that work more efficient in their eyes. You could say that in some cases, yeah, the tech works in that case, but it doesn't work for the many. It doesn't work for us who are not interested in incarceration. It doesn't work for people who are interested in actually addressing the harm that is in our societies. I really do think, though, there is, like, at the same time parallel conversations about, like, how do we work with people that are experiencing this? How do these calls come from them? But also at the same time holding, like, more mainstream organizations to account and saying, actually, you say that you protect the digital rights of all, or you say that you addressing human rights of everybody. So let's look at, okay, how does this technology impact everybody, really everybody, including marginalized communities, and take that to the logical extent, which means that we're not having policy recommendations which are calling for system tweaks or calling for less of a certain technology, but actually looking for the abolition of those things. Community-based organizing against surveillance, and surveillance in its broadest term, not just technologically enabled surveillance, but also other forms of surveillance. And also not just surveillance that is in a law enforcement or migration control context, but also those that we see as like very much in the private sphere. I'm thinking of worker surveillance, how you see many of these technologies also surveilling workers in like Uber or Deliveroo, and how like that is also a form of punitive sphere, even though it's outside of the state. Also is the surveillance of many people online, and in terms of what they're able to post online and not, a form of, I think, is also a punitive aspect as well. How there isn't that much data of this in Europe actually, but we do have like pockets of data which show that activists, particularly racial justice activists, we've seen some cases in France and the UK where using certain technologies has had them censored or banned for their content, and that looking also at that as a form of surveillance and enabling like these sorts of groups also to be like have a space in the digital rights realm, and seeing that is also privacy work, that is also the legitimate anti-surveillance work we should be focusing on and working with these groups too.
Thank you, Sarah. That was fantastic. And Dakshayani, I saw you nodding quite a lot there, and I'm going to come to you just before we open up for questions. I mean, do you have a conception of what this movement looks like?
Good question. I really love what others have said, and I guess my favorite thing to talk about on this general topic is I get in trouble for it, but how much I just really dislike largely white human rights activists who focus on, I guess, ethics and frameworks that I just think are so irrelevant, to be honest, like very relevant to some of the biggest harms. You know, when some of these technologies are literally, their purpose is racialized surveillance. And, you know, it's not just tech giants, it's some of the biggest weapons companies are involved in the border policing industry, and it's terrifying. And so when I see so much resource and attention going, I guess, to ethics frameworks, I really struggle. And I think, you know, defunding that would be a great start, and funding some of these incredible movements. And then I really like what others have said around, I guess, having a conversation about the actual issue that's going on. So I you know, kind of drawing inspiration from the defund the police call, and along with defund the police, the other call is fund other things. So fund, you know, public health, fund other things that create safe communities, and fund human connection. And I think in a similar way, I think we should think about that in relation to COVID. It's not technology that's going to get us out of it. It's actually all of these other things that exacerbate, addressing the exacerbated inequities in our society, and proper public health measures. But yeah, in terms of what the movement could look like, I again just draw so much inspiration from Mi Gente, but also other campaigners that in Australia as well that we're working with, who I guess just, it's not just one tactic, like others have said. There's really amazing grassroots organising work that's going on. But that in partnership, I think, with other interventions like employees, like uprising and getting together and organising and saying we don't actually want to work on these things. Alongside, I think, students in the have been organising around, you know, not allowing big tech to recruit easily from particular cohorts. And then the things that I personally work on with others is looking at what's the capital that's like driving the investment around these technologies, and how do you start to educate the big investors to to either take their money to divest out of these technologies, or to kind of use their holdings to kind of create a bit of agitation and challenge. So
thank you. Some great actions for people there. And actions is actually one of the things that people have been asking about. So we've had a couple of different questions around this. Somebody asking how thoughts on how students can resist attendance technologies forced on them by universities and colleges, which is something that I think apparently is being used as a form of visa compliance in higher education. But also then kind of broadening that out, somebody saying, well, one company that is big time into facial recognition is Amazon. Should I stop buying from Amazon? It's a software that lets you pay because it follows you around the store, but is also offered to police in the US. Should I be wearing face masks or anything else that confuses the software? So I think it's a question about what can individuals who maybe aren't working in the technology sector be doing? And that's to the panel, so anyone can jump in.
Yeah, maybe I can speak on the topic of higher education. I mean, I'm very much in the UK context, but as I said, kind of one eye to what the US is doing. We're in a really crucial time right now because higher education is struggling to understand how it's going to continue because of COVID. The funding is going to be much lower than expected because you know there won't be as much enrollment, and all the universities are worried about how their coffers are going to continue to be filled. So I would say cautiously that this is a really opportune moment for student activism to create solidaristic bonds between students who are immigrants as well as home students, to pressure their universities to the word that's coming to mind is divest. It's not quite the right word, but to decouple themselves from serving as an arm of the state, which is how they're currently working in terms of visa monitoring and compliance. It is going to require, to my mind, inter-university coalitions to be able to do this. I don't think that the kind of institution by institution approach is going to be as effective as it needs to be, but something that, you know, could be under the heading of the National Union of Students, for example, might be a way forward with this. Universities do what the government tells them to do, and students then do what universities tell them to do. But if students push back because in the marketized environment they are seen as consumers, I think that there is potential there for the universities to kind of to back off because they're concerned about their public perception as well as their pocketbooks.
Did anyone else want to jump in on that one?
I think
yes, thank you, Gracie, for pointing out Unis Resist Border Controls. Yeah, really important movement.
Yeah, and I think they've just done a big survey of all of the different surveillance practices going on in universities. I'm not sure, or I think they're conducting it right now. So one thing that people could do if you're in the UK is find their survey and actually fill it out, because that will support them with their future campaigning.
Fantastic, thanks, Gracie. One of the other questions that has come through is from Sophia, who says, how can people who work in data and AI like myself support you to remove or minimize these impacts in tech in our daily lives and approaches?
One of the things that I pointed out to Sophia in the chat was a resource from Tech Workers Coalition, which I actually came across at the Allied Media Conference in 2018. They had made a zine, and I loved the zine so much that I pinned it to my Instagram. But yeah, Tech Workers Coalition is doing great organizing in the US for how tech workers can resist so many different terrible aspects of tech. So I'd definitely check them out and see who else they recommend.
Sarah, Gracie, is there anything you would like to add to that for tech workers specifically?
I would just add that I think that unionizing is a really good idea in this context. There is a very broad notion that tech workers are all in a very similar position. And this is also not just about like addressing the harm in the things that like in terms of the AI or other automated systems that they might be developing, but also resisting against harmful employment practices, not just in terms of if maybe you yourself are not experiencing it, but also like across the world. We're seeing like really like harmful processes by which like many tech workers are completely exploited, like not just outside of Europe, in Europe too. And I think this is a really interesting area that's sort of like tangential to this conversation. But if we're talking about the context of worker surveillance and that relationship of power, there's many examples of workers and tech companies that also are experiencing many of the things that we've talked about today. So I would also look at not just addressing, looking to take design processes that are better, because I think that there's been some amazing work on that. Sasha Constanza Schock wrote the amazing book Design Justice, which is a really good example of how you could explore broader perspectives in the way that you design technology. I think that there's some technology that doesn't work for. The example is a bit tired by now, but we all agree that it's not about making facial recognition better, identifying black or brown faces, but actually abolishing certain types of technology where we see that they will inevitably have harmful consequences and inevitably have poor racial justice consequences. But then for other forms of technology, you could see how there is a benefit from having a design justice perspective, is essentially decentering the middle class, upper class, decentering the white gaze, the able-bodied gaze, the male gaze in design technology, and actually looking at how I think to Angela's point earlier about like imagining how technology could be used for a broader good, but doing so in a way that doesn't sort of overlook the harms that like we know exist in many technologies, particularly when they're used in a punitive sense. So I wouldn't recommend being like taking the like tech idealist perspective there. But yeah, I think combining that like day-to-day perspective in your work with also acknowledgement that actually there is a need for like a lot of work supporting worker movements in the tech field itself, that I think that people inside the tech field could really explore. And I'm not really aware of that much happening in broader Europe, but I think that maybe other panelists would have some examples of that.
Thanks for that, Sarah. Oh, sorry, there's a bit of an echo. Gracie, I might come to you on this next question from someone who asks, what are your thoughts around the problem where some data is omitted, leaving some individuals and groups invisible and therefore absent in policy decisions or even good news stories? And then I might come back to you, Dakshayani, on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is kind of by what process did that happen? I'm not an expert on kind of France data collection, etc. I spent a long time living there, but anyway, you know, so for example, the fact that they don't collect data on race, right? That's obviously a real problem. Thinking about the UK context, so I did a lot of campaigning with Against Borders for Children around the use of around a new data collection of children's nationalities and countries of birth by the Department for Education as part of the school census, which was meant to start in 2016. And, you know, we were saying in the context of a hostile environment, schools shouldn't be collecting this data. There was no money available for students with additional support needs. So we were saying this can't be what it's for, right? At the same time, though, there were lots of data people who were saying, but we need to know who these students are and you know, and where they are and how best to support them. And I think one of the things that we found really frustrating was that actually the data that was needed to know how many students there were with additional English language needs in a school was already being collected, but it was not being collected at a named pupil level, right? And it wasn't going into a state database that has a research exemption that's held in perpetuity. So the data was already there. But I think there was also a real failure to appreciate that actually the obligation was on the state to create the conditions of trust so that people, you know, if this data was genuinely going to be used for a good reason, you know, they needed to create the conditions of trust. And there were actually some really helpful data people who talked about the safeguards that exist around the national census and the penalties that exist for people who misuse that data that absolutely don't exist for the school census. So I think it was really difficult pushing against that current of all data is good data and more data is better. But ultimately, when a data sharing agreement between the DfE and the Home Office was released that said that that nationality and country of birth data was going to be included in a matching algorithm for immigration enforcement, and was then removed because of public outcry so that they could deny they were ever going to do it, well, then we were vindicated. But I'm not sure that we wouldn't have to have the same argument again. So I think the question is really kind of, you know, what's predatory inclusion, and what effort has the state or the data controller made to actually show it's safe to collect this data, there's a reason for collecting this data, and there's actually the resources to do the good thing that we say we're going to do with this data. And I think there also needs to be a rationale for why do you need to target the resources in this really pinpointed way, or should we actually be resourcing institutions in a way that is better for everybody, right? That means that we don't need this really granular level. You know, I'm not saying there's never going to be a need for targeting, but I think we have to kind of call that logic into question. So yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gracie. And Dakshani, I might come to you on that question, but build on it a little, because somebody else has asked around how, you know, people on the panel use and gather data in their own work and research and activism. So if we take that point in that, you know, perhaps there is data collecting that is used in activism, what does that look like? But also, how do you create that environment of trust that Gracie is talking about?
That's a great question. Yeah, it makes me go back to that concept of opacity and how it's kind of a privilege that's only allowed for, you know, people in power, right? And so it's so difficult to collect the data that we need to do the activism that we need to do for that very reason. So whether it's, you know, a lot of the speakers mentioned predictive policing initiatives, and in New South Wales, in the state that I live in, there's a similar initiative. It stops and searches kids as young as 10. 50% of them are First Nations kids, and you can't get any information about the algorithm, so you can't actually understand, you know, how are these decisions being made. You can't even inquire as to why you got on the list to be targeted for predictive policing. So these are the kinds of things that FOIs can only take you so far, and there needs to be more measures in place to kind of unpack that. But for my own work in more, I guess, corporate transparency, I am interested in kind of understanding data around, I think representation is limited, but race pay gaps and other ways like racial discrimination. How much, to what extent do corporations get people to sign non-disclosure agreements? Like these kinds of things that I'm often trying to find out are very difficult to find out. So it's really interesting that the opposite thing happens when you're talking about or institutions and people of power, is that it's very difficult to get your hands on the data that you're looking for. And I guess the last thing I just want to mention is that one thing that people might want to check out that's really interesting is there's been a lot of academic research and a body of work around Indigenous sovereignty in the Australian context, and that's a really interesting body of work that looks at, you know, what are the data that we need for self-determination. So that's really interesting starting point for kind of these conversations. I'll share a link in the chat.
Thank you. I've got a question here specifically for Angela, a follow-up to your question about inter-university student-led union. And they are asking, how do academics fit into this narrative? As much as student activism is important, it's often difficult to get engagement from students alone in a university that is home to many different stakeholders. So would you be able to flesh that out a little bit, Angela?
Yes, absolutely. So I guess I want to talk about my work with Building the Anti-Racist Classroom, which is a collective of women of color, scholar activists. We have 3 members here in the UK and 1 member in Australia. And we, since 2018, have been thinking about ways that we can bring some of those different university stakeholders together and work to level the power relations between them, at least in the spaces that we're creating for the temporary time that we've created them, to be able to have those conversations about how race inequality affects lives of all people at the university, from everyone from, you know, the porters and the cleaners to the chefs in the cafeteria to the students and the staff, both academic and professional services. And the first thing that was really surprising to us is how rare that space was and has been, and how infrequently those stakeholders are actually brought together and enabled to find out where their common ground is, and also given space to think through what is needed from the university to challenge that. So one of the things that stuck with me from that is there is scholar activism going on, there is student activism going on, but there needs to be the creation, and my colleague Sadvi is here on the call, there needs to be the creation of intergenerational support structures that academics, the join up academics, students, and all of the people who make the university run, many of whom are people of color, many of whom are women of color in particular. And there are really interesting movements going on, initiatives going on, like Justice for Cleaners, which is from King's College London, I believe, and the anti-racist activism at Goldsmiths University, where they occupied the town hall. They were really heavily invested in getting the cleaners brought in-house because they were initially contracted. So these kinds of things, I think, are of the moment. They're happening now, but they could be happening more. And if there is initiatives occurring at your university and you are a university stakeholder, I would really encourage you to put the feelers out to see who else in the university is interested in the work that you're doing and who could help support in their sphere of influence.
Thank you so much. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to get through the next couple of questions quite quickly. The next question is somebody asking about the possibility of big tech / social media. If there is a possibility of big tech and social media being life affirming and life enhancing, are there any examples of an organization doing good work on, say, and they're asking specifically around social media test, trace, and isolate, and the pandemic, which, you know, takes the risks that the panel is talking about. Are there any good examples that we can point to? And I might put that out to the panel. Sarah, maybe I might start with you, if there's anything in this space.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I understand with the respect to test, trace, and things like this, but I do think like we can recognize how social media is super affirming in many ways, in terms of like, not just in terms of recognizing that like its role in social movements, but also recognizing specifically that we shouldn't treat big tech as a synonym for social media as well. Like it is essentially talking about platforms, and we also could also think about connecting with other advocacy attempts which look at the need for like breaking up the monopolies of big tech on social media, which I think could help us sort of like address some of the surveillance concerns that we see, some of the censorship concerns that we see with Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram and other big social media platforms. I think there's some really interesting calls coming up in Europe with respect to the upcoming Digital Services Act, which is basically looking at like essentially supposed to be addressing how can we address harmful content online, basically. But in essence, it could like the potential recommendations could really lead to using social media as law enforcement for things like speech and terrorist content online, which, sorry about the sirens, which is I think like a harmful, quite like a harmful aspect of how we don't see that many connections between digital rights organizations and anti-racism organizations. Many anti-racism organizations are calling for sort of like more accountability of the tech companies, meaning more takedowns, more, basically more takedowns, more censorship, which I don't think is a bad thing to want hate speech to come offline. But in essence, what we also worry about doing is actually increasing the capacity of big tech, increasing their ability and in our world to basically be the enforcers of law, be the arbiters of what is acceptable content or not, which is what exists already. So I think this is a good way of why we need to have this connection between privacy, people that are working against big tech, but also against hate speech and other forms of racism. Is that, okay, this is an example of, actually social media being taken as a synonym for big tech, and actually what that is doing is sort of increasing their power. And we maybe could resist that. If we were to get to a stage where actually other business models and more smaller forms of social media could work, you could see an even more affirming nature of this. And you have some examples that I cannot remember, I will send after when I remember the name, but of attempts to build feminist social media platforms, which often in our environment won't work, right? It's not often not a plausible business model in a world where we have the Facebooks and the Twitter completely dominating massive percentages of the market. If you change the infrastructure,
this is where we get into the digital entrepreneurial machine and who is holding the purse strings and funding the startups and the innovation that comes from the ground up. So absolutely.
All right, I'm going to jump in really quickly and ask you all one final question, which is maybe framed, it's framed in a particular way, but hopefully I think will allow us to end on a note of hope. How do you stop yourself from, the person is asking, how do you stop yourselves from drowning in anger and fear and powerlessness over all of this? And what do you do to cope with the kind of, with knowing all of this in daily life? Maybe I'll start with you, Dakshayani.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess, I'm not really sure. Sometimes I'm drowning, but when I'm not, I guess it's connecting with people that are actually resisting all of the things that we're talking about. And even just witnessing what's happened very rapidly in recent months. So there's some incredible actors doing incredible work. And I guess there's kind of building on what Sarah and Angela were saying, there's kind of business models and interesting new things that I've been following that give me a lot of hope. So linked to that question about massive tech giants and social media, there's been a movement building for a little while now called kind of platform cooperativism. And essentially what it is what if workers owned the platforms, and what if workers kind of designed how these platforms were governed and how they operate? So there's some examples around I think it's called Green Taxi, which is in Colorado in the US, and it's an alternative to Uber. They kind of work closely with the union. They kind of govern how the platform runs. So these kinds of business models, but applied in other industries and sectors, I think is really exciting for what the future of tech could be. And I'd love to see, to Angela's point, kind of, just creativity and new ways of building the organizations and building the technologies that are more life affirming. I think we just need to rethink some of these fundamental business models so that we can get away from the giant, scary corporate monopoly power thing.
Thank you. We have run out of time, devastatingly, but I want to thank all of the panelists. I want to thank Dakshayani, Dr. Angela, Sarah, Gracie. Thank you, Arik from Web Roots Democracy. Thank you all of you for joining us for this session. I feel challenged and affirmed, and I'm gonna definitely think about this and chew on all the things that have been brought up and all the links and so on. A copy of this recording will be shared over the next few days, so keep an eye out on your email for that. And thank you all again so much. Enjoy the rest of your day, inshallah. Take care.